So Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to our talk, Private Schools Negotiating Questions of Choice, Equity, and Competition. My name is Elizabeth O'Neill. I'm the interim leader of the Hong Kong campus here for the University of Chicago. I'm also the Associate Dean for Booth Global Degree Programs in London and Hong Kong, and Executive Director of the London campus. So very delighted to be here tonight and to welcome you here. And we also are sharing today's event live via Zoom, via Facebook, and YouTube. And a note for the Zoom audience members, you are welcome to submit questions using the quick Q&A function, and we'll be able to take those as we go through this evening's session. So the University of Chicago Hong Kong campus launched this Nexus Asia program last year, and it's dedicated to collaborating with and showcasing UChicago PhDs and alumni, PhD alumni and their institutions throughout the Asia Pacific region through lectures, academic workshops, and research. So we offer travel grants to our Nexus scholars, facilitating their travel and research in the region, and to promote and activate our campus here in Hong Kong, which I hope you will all agree is a lovely space to convene and host these events, showcasing thought leadership from our PhDs. PhD alumni, I should be clear. So tonight we are very pleased to have Professor Ankur Sarin, our Nexus scholar, with us. Professor Sarin is a faculty member at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and he obtained his PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago in 2004. Professor Sarin worked with mathematics policy research, MPR, prior to joining academia. And a shared theme in his research is an attention to the consequences of inequalities and instruments used to counter them. These include public policy and civil society initiatives. And these are instruments that he has also tried to support and learn from with various action research initiatives. So thank you, Professor Sarin, for coming to the Hong Kong campus. I'll hand the stage to you, and also just a further welcome to everyone here in the room and to those joining us remotely. So over to you, Professor Sarin.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that very warm welcome. Thank you to the University of Chicago Center, Nexus, for making this possible. I was to do this in September, but then the super typhoon timed it very well, and I didn't make that trip, but I'm very happy that I finally made it. It's a Monday evening, and I'm very grateful to those of you who've come here. What I am going to try to do is we can have a conversation. I don't necessarily need to give a lecture here. I don't need to necessarily tell you anything, but we can have a question. We can have a conversation on a question that I think all of us have thought about at some point or the other. This question of private schools, right? And what should be the role of private schools? And I'm going to restrict myself to K to 12. So I'm not talking about higher education. I'm talking about primary, secondary schooling. So if I could just maybe get a sense from the group that is here itself, how many of you believe we should be doing more to promote private schools in this space? Nobody? Okay, it depends.
Yeah, in a sense of promote, you mean to advocate that private school education is it's better for it's a better way of educating the K to 12.
And therefore government policies should also be encouraging private schools. That's in a sense of, that's what I mean by promoting.
That's kind of difficult,
Okay.
That's really kind of difficult because different sitting in different sides of the table have different views.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And that's in some ways that's where I wanted to begin with also. It's almost like a religion, right? Typically, I'm not saying necessarily all of you, but it's almost like a religion that there are some who just believe strongly, passionately about private schools, and then there are some who strongly, passionately advocate against private schools and feel that there is no space for them. But the reality is they're there. The reality is that they are in our landscape, and I will share the Indian experience with greater detail. They're nearly 50% of the schools that are there in India. And it's growing, right? And I think, in a sense, we have to move past this binary divide that we have between saying, look, private schools are good or private schools are bad. We have to focus more on questions around what about maybe private schools are not appreciated by us. Because those elements that are not appreciated by us in terms of private schools, it may very well be true that they're present even in public or government-provided schools. So if we care about even questions of equity, and typically that's where our support for government schools comes from, and sort of arguments against private schools is that private schools tend to create inequitable outcomes. But the reality is standardizing the entire education experience is impossible. And even so, you have a lot of variation even within the public schools system. There are severe inequalities even within systems which are, in a sense, entirely state or public dominated, right? And so it's a very old question in a way. And why should we discuss an old question? Well, because what we learn about this question changes. And those are the aspects that I would like to share in today's conversation with you, drawing specifically on one mandate in India's right to education. And I'll come to that as we go along. But just to motivate that this is not a question that comes either just from my peculiar interests or coming from India. This is an article that I read in Singapore as I was preparing for the talk and when I got stuck at that point. And the headline was, "Why American Parents Are Abandoning Public Schools." That they've seen the steepest decline in decades. And this decline is going to have implications for the public school system itself, right? This is going to mean as children leave the public school system, go to private schools. And I think now in the US, almost every single state has a voucher program of some sorts, right? There are charter schools. So as children leave the public school system, this also leaves less resources in the public school system, which means worse student-teacher ratios. You don't have science teachers. And so there is these systemic consequences that people are apprehensive and anxious about. This is, again, a headline from September. The question about the Hong Kong International School here, which I believe is a very prestigious school in Hong Kong. And it has been sued by the founder, which is the Lutheran Church. And the reason it has been sued is, at least that's what the claim is, that it is serving only an elite section of Hong Kong, and it has deviated from the original agreement of being open to all children. Now, in Hong Kong itself, Hong Kong has, I think, this very innovative direct subsidy scheme idea of supporting private schools as well. And what the literature says, at least what I have been able to understand, is again this question of sort of it seems to be attracting students of a particular background and promoting inequities. So the Hong Kong system, and again, I try to familiarize myself for the purposes of this talk. It's very interesting in the sense that although bulk of children do go to government schools, most of these are actually aided schools. So there are private organizations or private operators, even though they're fully funded by the government, right? And that's a bulk of the schooling, whether it be secondary or primary. And then there are these DSS schools, which is, I believe, which have come up in the last 2 decades. And these numbers have sort of more or less been stable over the last 10 years in terms of how many schools there are and how many children they enroll. As I said, the literature is talking about that while parents are choosing DSS schools. So what distinguishes a DSS school is that the DSS school can charge a fees, and it gets a subsidy from the government as well, right? And there's a sort of a complicated formula about how much subsidy they would get from the government. But rather than promoting rather than promoting sort of choices which is about pedagogy or in terms of what is learned, etc., it appears that the kind of choice making the DSS schools have promoted have got to do more with what improves my chance of getting into college, right? Rather than necessarily sort of a competition between pedagogies and possibilities of education. If there are any questions that any of you have along the way, kindly raise them so we could, as I said, very happy to have this as a conversation. This is coming from India, and I will talk about what this RTE, right to education, essentially is. But this is the private schools who went on a strike, saying, and these are their words, we take pride that private schools are serving over 55% of the students in Andhra Pradesh, which is a big state in India. Without any financial burden, 85% of the private schools have fees less than 1/3 of the expenditure made by the government. This is often the rationale for private schools. And any disruption to private schools administration not only affects 10,000 managements, but also affects about 300,000 staff and 40 lakh students. That's around 4 million. And saying that this will be you will have blood in your hands if you try to regulate us under RT. This is a headline from today, which talks about the private equity handbook for turning non-profit schools into cash cows. This is from India, and where they talk about this. The reason this news was there because this education infrastructure firm is having a IPO, and therefore a lot of the financial details are available. They talk about how the entity paying the rent is the same as the entity receiving the rent, and therefore the rents are being, this is clear rent seeking, right? As literal as it can be. And this is in a sense, this is sort of a failure of the regulation. And this is the reason why I really want to, this is the graphic display about what was going on here in terms of how money was being made via a not-for-profit entity. So in India, you cannot run a school as a for-profit entity formally, right? But clearly there is a channel, and the channel sort of looks like this, wherein you have a firm which sort of manages the property, so you lease the property, and then you get a firm which manages the school, and then there are payouts. So it's my submission is that our animosity between public, private, government, profit allows us to sort of not pay attention to what the real issues are. And the real issues, I feel, are very clear, flagrant violations of basic norms of doing any activity, right? You don't need to be convinced that there seems to be some conflict here. So overall, yes, there's a dramatic change in terms of public-private mix. The general consensus that had been developed over time was that a common school system is essential. That seems to be under threat for various reasons, but one of the primary reasons is the logic of markets, in a sense, dominates most of our lives in most countries today. And that it has come to sort of permeate into schooling shouldn't be surprising as well, right? There is a greater emphasis on making sure that choices are available. There is a greater emphasis on sort of having competition as sort of a means of accountability. And the question of are public funds being utilized effectively, right? Because the idea that we could go and tax in an unlimited way no longer sort of carries weight. Right? Interestingly, what is also changing is the expectation. Is it the government's responsibility to provide schooling? So and this is, India stands out on this, but nevertheless, these numbers are indicative of a larger trend, that 46% of surveyed in, only 46% of surveyed adults in India agreed that provision of school education is primarily the government's responsibility. They're not even in a majority, right? So this is the plan for the rest of the time that I have. I'll briefly talk to you about what are the instruments, the wickedness of the problem, India's right to education, and how we perhaps tame this wicked problem, right? Now, when we talk about public funding of private, right, that's really what I am speaking about in this talk. I'm not speaking exclusively, the private sector outside that, because I think that's where the questions around equity and choice and competition really come in, right? So there are two primary instruments. One is aided schools, which is what I described to you in terms of how Hong Kong runs most of its schooling. And then there is the idea of vouchers, school vouchers. And the one distinction, of course, is the extent of regulation. Aided schools are typically far more heavily regulated, a lot more control under the government. The government is theoretically making choices, whereas vouchers, the choice is left to the parents. The money follows the student in a sense. So wherever the child goes with a school voucher saying, hey, this is what the government has given me. I would like to study in your school. Now, vouchers have had a controversial history. And that's one reason why, despite being theoretically very sort of attractive, they've not caught fire, at least yet. So the voucher history is intermingled with the history of racial integration in the US. So around the same time as people like Professor Milton Friedman and Patrick Buchanan, et cetera, were advocating vouchers from primarily the perspective of individual choice and individual freedom, there was also the effort to integrate schools. And vouchers got picked up by certain groups as sort of means to escape the integrated schools, right? And of course, the other country which has been known for school vouchers is Chile, where, again, a controversial intermixing with that the voucher program was essentially institutionalized under the dictatorship of Auguste Pinochet and the Chicago boys, and we are in the Chicago campus. So what's the basic logic of vouchers, theoretically at least? Well, and this is, I'm giving you this as the instances of vouchers, but you can imagine this is the logic for competition as well, right? That you're basically trying to encourage parental choice by provision of vouchers, which is a financial instrument to sort of use, and along with information so that parents make better choices. Now, how do you do that? By evaluating the schools, assessing the students essentially. You also then, on basis of performance, you might have an incentive scheme that better performing schools might get reimbursed more. You may also have a system wherein you say a lower income family might get a higher voucher. You may also have a system where you allow schools to charge a fee which is beyond the voucher. So there are these different variations that can take, right? But the basic theory says that, okay, look, if we've promoted parental choice, there would be higher levels of competition, which would also then lead to, on the supply side, more pedagogical diversification, innovation, and the quality of and efficiency of schooling improves. That's the basic logic for why choice intermixed with vouchers can promote both competition, right, and equity. So the vouchers serve as an instrument for equity, providing choice, and hopefully leading to competition. Now, in practical terms, this hasn't worked out exactly as theory predicts. I mean, that nothing surprising. Theory always is supposed to work in specific contexts, right? And so when you said it depends, maybe that's the right answer, that such a system may well work in certain contexts. And the context could be, for instance, even something as evident as like the physical geographical context. So for instance, it's been argued in the Hong Kong situation, which is a relatively small geography, there could in fact be increased competition. But then if you have, when you're talking about dispersed geographies, you may not have enough schools operating there to actually translate to competition, right? The other in terms of, again, this is this first evidence comes from Chile, is that the schools do not compete really by improving the education services or raising the quality standards as much as they do by screening their students for different set of criteria. So the moment you leave the choice to schools and then you evaluate them basis of how the students are performing, the schools do what you would naturally expect. They pick the right students. Now, I talked to you about segregation, and Milton Friedman sort of acknowledged this. He said, yes, true, this is sort of a counter argument to and a flaw in maybe the voucher system. But the solution that he advocated was, as is true for Milton Friedman in many other instances, you need to persuade people to change their attitudes. You can't force this. So in a sense, he chose freedom. He chose choice over sort of an imposition of integration, right? And while it might have sounded very idealistic back then, I think it sounds even more idealistic today. That some of people's attitudes and preferences can be changed to not carry prejudices within us. And in fact, one could argue that that's basically a function of schooling. Schooling is supposed to promote those ideas of integration, right? And that's the reason why this is not a simple problem that we are talking about. And unfortunately, as I'll share with you, most of the times we treat it as a simple problem, right? The wickedness of the problem stems from, I think, two very underlying reasons. One is we want, in a meritocratic society, education to determine a person's success. We don't want to standardize outcomes. We want to reward people who do better, and in an education serves as a marker for that, right? But likewise, in a just society, we don't want school experiences and outcomes to be independent. We want them to be independent of characteristics that I may be born with. Where a child is born shouldn't determine what the child's life is going to be. And in a sense, the education intervention or the school intervention is supposed to mediate in that. But the more closely we tie up education and success, right, the more people get wired into competing to get better educational experiences and making sure that their child or whoever they're supporting moves ahead, achieves those better outcomes via education. And so that leads to perverse incentives, which then distorts the whole idea of education in a sense, right? So while in fact, yes, they are promoting egalitarianism, schools can promote, and they as a system, they do. Let's not, in this discussion about equity and inequity, let's not diss the idea of schooling itself, right? And I think that's fairly important for us to also hold on to. But we need to acknowledge where they create structural inequities, right? And I could do this with any country. I've chosen Singapore just because it's more transparent and clear there. Singapore has tried to really solve these problems in so many different ways, right? Singapore, if you're a citizen, you have to go to a government school. But now they also want to promote choice. They also want to promote merit. So they say, okay, well, we have variation in schooling in terms of secondary schooling, but all children have to sit in an exam in the end of the 6th grade, and on the performance of that examination, you get to go to good and worse schools. Now, the government would like you to believe that there aren't any good or worse schools. There are all schools are good schools, right? But parents aren't really convinced, right? And nobody really gets convinced by this, right? So they've tried to do various things. They've tried to say, okay, we won't reveal the test scores. Well, parents found other ways to disclose the test scores, right? They said, okay, well, alumni preference was, important because that shows a close relationship, but maybe we can also allow people to volunteer. So open this up so that if you volunteer with a school, you develop a better relationship, you know the school better, school knows you better, right? Which created its own sets of problems. And there is this question of whenever you've had a common school system of any sort, neighborhood schools, the richer, the wealthier, move to those neighborhoods, right? So and that was the same issue in Singapore, and they've tried to sort of address this in saying, okay, a 30-month residency requirement. Well, that only increases the inequalities, right? Questions of in the same problem in Pakistan, where you had a public-private partnership, schools were being evaluated on test performance. The school said, let's get better children. That's how we will compete. So there are clear limits to how much we can curb both capital, social capital, cultural capital, and financial capital, as well as individual agency, right? So even in systems which are very state-dominated, more standardized, you have the shadow education system, which Professor Mark Bray from University of Hong Kong has written so much about. The shadow education, meaning the tuitions, the private tutoring, the coaching, all of that, which are all clearly dependent on financial resources, right? The more you build competition into the process of getting into the better schools, the greater are the incentives to game it, right? And that's again something that we all know from in terms of institutions. And then the more suspicious people become. Are really all schools good schools, given how much you're trying not to prevent us from making good choices? So and even in a system like China, right, where again very sort of controlled by states, very limited provision of private schooling, but in some form or the other, parents break through that neighborhood restriction, right? And that's choices. It's not so much about freedom, but it's more a means to end in a highly competitive education system, which the Chinese system is. Now, India's right to education, to keep it short, I'll talk about this one particular clause, the 25% clause. 25% clause says that all private schools, self-financed, even if you're not getting any funds from the government, you have to set aside 25% of seats at the entry level for students from economically weak and socially disadvantaged sections. And so it's unlike other voucher programs, this is not a choice given to the schools. All schools have to do it. The government conducts the admissions process, a lottery if necessary. So the government decides eligibility, allocates students to different schools, and the schools are reimbursed either an amount equal to the school fee or what the government spends per child, whichever is lower, which creates its own set of issues. There is a neighborhood clause there as well. It was challenged immediately as soon as it was announced, but the Supreme Court said, no, private schools also have to do this. This is not just the responsibility of the Indian government system, right? Now, a brief introduction to the Indian schooling landscape. As I said, we've expanded without a common school system. So the overall, there are 250 million students studying in India between K to 12, approximately. The private unaided schools or the self-financed schools, they enroll 51% of urban children and 24% of rural school-going children. These are the official statistics. The unofficial ones are even higher. And these are, in terms of expenses, very different. So the expenditure in the private schools are nearly 9 times that incurred in government schools, right? Multiple reasons for the failure of developing a common school system in India, right? One is relatively low commitment by the government in terms of public expenditure. The issue of language, which also, I believe, played out here in Hong Kong, when the only some schools allowed the medium of instruction to be English, and therefore the elite parents exited. Same sort of story in India. And then there is the caste system, right? Which meant historically there was this view that not because of the close relationship between caste and occupation, not all children need to be schooled, right? And of course, this sort of desire for differentiation and exclusivity that is associated with the caste system as well. Now, the official rationale for the mandate, the 25%, was A, it's not just the government's responsibility, and B, even for the other 75%, if you want to give you a better quality schooling, what does schooling mean? It should mean preparing you to function in society. How are we preparing you to function in society if you don't have exposure to 75% of society? Right? Because you can, I mean, just roughly speaking, you can imagine that the 75% are the, the folk out there who are not studying in elite spaces, right? So to create these shared spaces is what the mandate was justified. Now, how have I engaged with it? In my introduction, we spoke a little bit about action research. So I've been working on this particular mandate since 2013 onwards. First, in terms of action research, I was studying social mobility. Then I got motivated to work on this mandate as a result of that. It wasn't really being implemented. And we, helped in the process of get the ball rolling, right? Getting this mandate implemented. It was not so much getting the mandate implemented. For me, it was also about working with students and for us to understand how policy implementation works in practice, right? And therefore, while doing it, so making the road while walking, that's how I, in a sense, describe it using words of Paulo Freire. And this is sort of just to give you a sense of how we started. You see, this we get covered by media talking about what we are trying to do here. And what I want to bring attention to is this slide, which you'll see, stories here which are not in English. And that is a marker, at least for me, of how over time, as we worked on this, the policy got deepened. So we moved from being covered only by English media, who would cover an elite institution like us, to this becoming a part of mainstream communities, so that there was a percolation of awareness about how this mandate and how this works. Now, I'll skip these interventions in terms of how we try to inform the community. I'm a regular academician as well. So I've also done conventional research, and these are all just publications that have arisen from working on this. But overall, assessing the mandate, yes, there are continuing contestations. That first headline that I started out with, saying in Andhra Pradesh, that state, we will go on strike if the government doesn't pay attention to us. How do I look at this mandate? How has it been performed? Well, I think first we celebrate the fact that it has been implemented. Just because a policy exists on paper doesn't mean it's going to be implemented. And especially a policy like this, it's an achievement that it has been implemented. 5 million students study under this mandate. Potentially 16 million should have been. So you can see that as a failure as well. I'm seeing, the glass 1/3 full, right? And over the years, what has emerged is clearly that there are barriers to information which keep people from accessing and availing the mandate. Students who have entered, and retention surveys done by Indus Action, and I should have mentioned upfront that what I'm presenting today is also drawing from work that I'm doing with Tarun Cherukuri, who's a founder of Indus Action, says that there is a fairly high retention rate, and even among girls, right? But 61% of the parents report that they additional expenditure on books, uniform, transport, and projects. So there is some reimbursement done for these things, but so it's not free. So even though the right to education talks about right to education for free and compulsory education, it's not free. Which these distributive burdens and the fact that it's not really free also means that there are distributive implications, even within this. So even though I'm setting aside 25% seats for these children, what we find typically is that it's the slightly better off among this group who are able to benefit, right? And so if you take so for instance, you take the bottom quintile and just survey, because that would be, in a sense, the ones that are most deserving of this policy. One study finds that only 20% of those households actually knew about this, right? In another study, which is a much larger study, which is sort of still in its working paper version, says that around 30% of eligible children attend private schools. So they looked at this, the population of children who are eligible. They find 30% of those are actually studying in private schools, but only 12.5% apply for the mandate. Right? So theoretically, all of these 30% who are studying in private schools should have also applied for the mandate, given their interest in studying in private schools. Right? The applicant pool is more likely to be from upper castes, relatively better blocks in the state, and more likely to be from lower income families, which is in contradiction to the other idea of that this is sort of, so the caste, there is a, helping the more privileged, but as far as income, going to the lower income, right? What about schooling outcomes? So here I'm essentially talking to you about participation, access, right? What about outcomes that in terms of sort of that emerge subsequently? So one argument is it does not substantively change the schools that the parents would have sent their children to anyway. So it's not like these are necessarily better quality schools that the children are going to. The study that I participated in says that no, and our study's context was it was an information campaign where we were actually reaching out to the most disadvantaged parents, right? We find that compared to their siblings, the children who study under the RT, the mandate, are more likely to attend English medium and study further away from home, which are two markers that we take for quality. There's not been many studies yet in terms of learning outcomes, but one study which, again, very large sample, looks at this question of learning outcomes, suggests that there are very significant gains for children who are studying under this mandate compared to others who had also applied, but because of the lottery did not get in. But they argue that there is a lot of variation, even within the schools in which children are studying, which is the underlying issue, that there are inequities even within private schools and there are inequities within public schools. So it's not, so that's why the urge to move beyond this discourse or beyond the binary that I was referring, right? When it comes to systemic outcomes, the mandate was critiqued fairly heavily. Some of the most influential commentators declared this to be a blow to the government schooling system. And like I said, in terms of private schools and government schools, there's almost like there's nobody who really wants to touch this mandate, because the people who advocate for private schools, they don't like the mandate because they see this as an imposition. People who advocate for government schools, they don't like the mandate because they see this as promoting privatization, right? So if you're trying to stand in the middle here and trying to work on this mandate, you're getting no support. That's the bottom line as far as working on this mandate goes, right? So because the idea, the threat is that the funds will get diverted, very similar to the US argument that funds would get diverted, right? But paradoxically, the government has also been accused of not paying the private schools, the reimbursements. So, and this undermines the whole legitimacy of the mandate as well, right? Because then you make it easier for the private school to protest against this mandate, right? And again, the most comprehensive study, which looks at this question of saying, okay, well, if we are increasing competition via private schools, does that translate to better public schools? And there's very little evidence of that. So one theory that sort of some of us, maybe hoped for was that this competition would actually help the public school system as well, right? We are not finding much evidence for that. Now, but there are several questions that go beyond, in a sense, the mandate, which go beyond India, which still we should be asking for private schools, right? What is the envisioned public role for private schools? So even in the case of India, what many governments have done is they have said, okay, look, if there is a government school in your neighborhood, then we will not implement the mandate, which is against my reading of the act. But nevertheless, the question that we should be asking is, these governments is, okay, if you are not going to get these private schools to fulfill this obligation, then what should they be doing? What should their role be in terms of addressing the question of inequity, right? So there's this very provocative statement that one of the members of the drafting committee of the Right to Education made, Professor Anil Sadgopal. He said, there is really no such thing as a private school. And it's a very interesting statement because it is basically saying that, look, every school in some way or the other, when a schools by definition are engaged in a public task, right? Education has very strong public good characteristics, as we all know, in terms of externalities, in terms of spillovers. And given that every school is engaged in a public task, every school is engaged in activities which have very strong public implications. So this idea that we should have completely detached private schools is not an idea that makes conceptual sense, right? Even going beyond the economic rationale of looking it as a public good characteristic, at the end of the day, the schools is where societies come to be created. Schools is where the public comes to be created. What a shared sense of what does it mean to be a citizen of a country, right? And maybe that's one of the reasons why some governments are very reluctant to give up control on schooling. And I understand, I acknowledge that there is a tension there. But at the same time, that socialization, purpose, and task of schooling needs to be recognized by actors across the board. Right? That is an important purpose for the schools themselves. Right? Now, we would like to make a distinction between choices, right, for which individuals can be held personally responsible, and circumstances for which we cannot hold individuals responsible. And we would like to sort of promote, in a sense, we would like to promote choices. We would like to increase individual accountability. We would like to increase individual engagement in the choice-making process. But the truth is, separating these out, choices and circumstances, is a very difficult thing to do, right? Because circumstances also determine perhaps both in terms of what my choice set is, what do I get to choose, and how do I look at these choices that I have? What are my preferences? What do I care about more? How much do I care about education, right? The idea of sort of, so circumstances being independent of choices is a difficult one to sort of believe, right? And given this, and moreover, when you take into account the fact that these decisions are not being made by children themselves, right? So this is not also a space which is lending itself to a market-like, context. So where I'm just going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes. I think one of the things that we have been reluctant to do in talking about private and public schools, as I said, we should be looking more at the consequences rather than necessarily this distinction. But we need to recognize the politics of the problem. We need to recognize that and the interactions of multiple systems that are determining what's going on in the school system, right? If your economic system is based on a highly competitive capitalistic logic, for instance, right? It is incongruent to sort of say that, look, I can have a flat, democratic, equitable school system. These things are going to run into each other, right? What's the larger culture which is shaping the environment, right? That is going to impinge on the school system. The school system doesn't sit outside society. It doesn't sit outside the economy. It is very much within that. So you have to, when you're looking at, trying to look at this problem itself, we need to start with that perspective, right? So where would I, in a sense, end? One, like I've been emphasizing, let's shed this binary discourse between private good, private bad, right? They exist. Let's figure out a way that the issues that they create, those perhaps might be mitigated. they're not going to disappear. And I think, at least in the context of a country like India, where as I showed the numbers to you, it's wishful thinking to sort of say that, okay, now we could have complete nationalization, and that's not really the direction we should be going to as well. And therefore, I feel while we may want to promote choice, competition is a virtue, or can be a virtue, depending on how it is regulated, right? The importance of a right is paramount in this space, because what the idea of a right does, it gives the parent, the child, it's like an asset that they can take, maybe to the courts, maybe in terms of the administration, on the basis of which they can advocate for better outcomes. It's imperfect, but like with any other system, which will need time to sort of evolve. You take criminal law, you take civil law. These are things that are always under interpretation, under improvement, and we come to sort of better understandings of what is right and what is wrong in given contexts, right? The idea of a right, and that's why, in a sense, I have, while being very frustrated on working on this mandate itself, I've come to even more strongly subscribe to why this should in fact be a right, right? And lastly, this is not going to be, it's a wicked problem, as I said. Wicked problems are never solved, because you think like Singapore thought they solved something, some other problem emerged, right? They solved the problem of Alumni Connect by introducing the option of volunteering. That created its own set of problems, because people with better cultural capital would volunteer, people with more time could volunteer, right? So wicked problems don't lend themselves to simple solutions. At best, you can tame the problem. And the way to tame this problem, in a sense, is, again, continuous civic action, democratic action, right? Wherein you open up spaces. So in India, for instance, another part of the right to education has this idea of a school management committee. The US government schools, the US public schools also have this idea of sort of, school districts, and there's a lot of power that is handed over there. It has its set of issues. There's no denying that. But my argument here is that the only way we can evolve and move, in a sense, move forward, or at least mitigate the adverse consequences, is greater civic engagement, accompanied by more jurisprudence, which can only occur in the framework of a rights-based approach. So that's where sort of I'll end. I've gone a little bit over time, but I'm happy to have your questions and comments. Yes.
For the question. Thank you very much for the talk. So I kind of want to go sort of back to the root of this. There seems to be a perception that, at least among some populations, that private schools are better, but you've said, looking at outcomes, that's not universally true. So I guess I wanted to hear if you have a point of view of where that perception came from.
I can draw more from the Indian context for sure. So one of the things that's happened over time is while people accept that there is diversity in the private schools, and some private schools are better and some are worse, people see the government school as one homogeneous entity. So the government school, as one local cooperator who's very, counselor who was very involved in education, he said government schools the brand has become bad. Now, but nevertheless, so even though there is variation in private schools, why do people prefer private schools? One is the medium of instruction. So private schools promise that they will teach you English medium. We did one study where we were trying to understand why parents are choosing private schools, right? So, and then also trying to see whether parents' perceptions about private schools actually matched what the private schools did in practice. So what parents appreciated besides the medium of instruction was more discipline in private schools. That the gates would be shut at a particular point in time. There would be some kind of sort of feedback that they would see on the notebooks, and they felt that therefore the child was learning something. Because in terms of actual learning outcomes, there isn't much difference. But in terms of sort of processes, the private schools seem to run processes which appeal to parents more. There is also the question of signaling. In large part, which is an issue with schooling, right? It's not just about learning; it's about also status signaling. So, which school do I send my child to? What school uniform is my child wearing? Right? What does the bag look like? Those are also sort of factors that go into sort of parents, having this preference for private schools. Does that?
Yep. Yes, thank you. And I should say my bias is I am a product of public school. So thank you.
And I should also add, because even in the Indian system where the government or the public school system is often so derided, some of the best schools are actually public schools. So the Kendriya Vidyalaya system, which runs for central government employees and a little bit open for others as well, is one of, in terms of performance and learning outcomes, one of the best. The institution that I am from, it's a public institution. I mean, I'm now moving to higher education. So it's not like the public system is not capable of doing a better job either, which is what the larger perception has come to be as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarin, about the talk. I think in Hong Kong, the general perception of the parents about private and public, as you say, we're not talking about private. Okay, we're talking about, so let's compare the public school with the DSS. So DSS is still government aided, but they have more freedom of formulating how they're going to educate the children. I think general perception of people in Hong Kong is they believe in school, if they have more freedom in determining how they're going to educate the children, they tend to be better. Okay, say in Hong Kong public schools, no, all the students have to take the DSE. Whereas in the DSS schools, many schools offers IB and some even A levels, and which in a sense they cater for students that might not fit to sit at DSE. They might, they may perform better, if they choose the IB, which is a more rounded program, or maybe even A levels, which is more a streamlined program. So I think that's the general concept of the parents in Hong Kong, of course. No, about the choosing between the DSS and also the versus the public school. I'm not sure about the financial consequences because we do not have vouchers in Hong Kong. But I heard the DSS schools, now of course, majority of them have offer bursaries, but actually not many people take up the bursaries, apply for the bursaries, maybe because people would think, even with the bursaries, there are when they're in the DSS schools, many of them, the social segregation is there. Apart from just the school fees and things, there are other activities, as you say, the shadow education, that involves. So that's what I understand, of parents' choice of education in Hong Kong.
No, thank you. And I'll just drawing on your comment, the issue of stigmatization that also occurs for children who study under this mandate, especially in the more elite schools. That's also been one of the criticisms of this mandate. Now, those who sort of formulated the mandate argue that, look, we were cognizant of that, and that is why we made two decisions. One is we said at least 25%. So there's a sort of potentially a critical mass of children who are coming from socially disadvantaged sections, from similar sort of backgrounds. And two, the admissions under this mandate can only happen at the entry level. So if the school is starting at nursery, it has to happen there. If it's happening at first grade, it has to happen there. You can't sort of enter in at a later grade. And so hopefully the integration and the extent to which sort of household background characteristics affect the child's education trajectory are potentially mitigated. Now, this does not fully address the issue of shadow education. And some work that I've done separately also points out to the fact that children who are using this mandate are also end up spending more on tuitions, despite potentially going to better quality schools, right? Because they see these as not as sort of substitutive, but as complements, saying that, look, I will go to a better tuition because now I'm going to a better school. So which creates, so there is this paradoxical element to it. There was something else that it slipped my mind, but thank you for that.
May I ask a question around about the workforce within the public and private sectors and the training that they receive in India? Is it similar workforce in both sections? Because you talked, there wasn't a lot of, I think, from the public system, competition in regards to the outcomes or ambition to compete against the private sector. What I'm interested to unpack what that looks like. I know, for example, in Hong Kong and in Scotland, isn't really a difference in the pay scales between the two sectors.
Right.
However, in Edinburgh, where I came before I worked in Hong Kong, there was massive competition between the public and private sector in the primary age group, because we would lose a lot of our secondary students to the private sector. So the public sector primary schools were highly competitive to keep our students into our local secondary schools. So I just wondered what the difference was, because it wasn't remunerated much more. But I just wondered if there was a difference for the workforces and potentially the ambition and the values that come forward to push for those specific outcomes and challenge.
You're referring to the teachers, and yeah. So the teachers in government schools formally are at a pay scale which is much higher than that of the private schools.
Okay.
Now I'm saying formally, but reasonably, it varies from state to state, but a reasonably large percentage of these teachers also in contractual terms, so they don't get that pay scale which they would be getting if they were full-time employed, sort of on the tenure in a sense. But overall, on average, a government teacher gets paid a whole lot more than a private school teacher.
Okay.
And this is also one of the proponents of the private schools who would say that, look, we should just move completely to private schools, often use the efficiency argument, that it is more efficient to do schooling via private schools because we are paying teachers less. In terms of learning outcomes, we're doing slightly better than government schools. Maybe some are doing much better, but on average, slightly better, and we're doing it at a lower cost. So then the question arises, who are these teachers, right? And there are studies which say that basically a large proportion of these teachers in the so-called affordable private schools, which are the bulk of the private schools out there, are essentially young women who are, in the Indian context, sort of waiting to get married. And so they're willing to take a very low salary, a pittance, really. And so there's a continuous churn of teachers in these schools, which is not conducive to learning or sort of building an education system. It's not.
costs and the capacity for that, and what needs to be in place for everyone to flourish.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And so that's where the efficiency logic doesn't really hold, in my view, because it's a completely unsustainable logic, right? You cannot run a school. So the other aspect, one is, they're either waiting to get married. The other is they're waiting to get into the government school system. So they're willing to bide a couple of years in the hope that they would get into the government school system on a high salary. Now, this means that your workforce is contingent on a reasonably big size government school system existing. And if you are going to kill that, or you want to curb against salaries, then you will automatically be killing this as well. So yes, the issue of workforce is, both in questions of motivation are fairly important. I should also add, though, things are not hunky-dory in the government school system either, right? You have better qualified teachers being paid more, but in several states, not all. The teacher selection process is one which is marred by a whole lot of corruption, especially because the payoffs are so different, right? That lends itself to a whole lot of corruption. So there is also this sort of practice in some places where you get a government school job, you don't actually go teach, you get the salary, you pay a share to somebody else to. So none of these lend themselves to very simple solutions, right? And that's where I sort of I'm essentially emphasizing, maybe it's too large a point, but if you don't build stronger institutions because of law, because of civic mobilization, it's impossible to address these problems. I hope that answered.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting.
I'm wondering if your research has taken you internationally, if you look at some of the league tables that exist, and then if you look at that right to choice within those high-performing schools by those international measures. I don't know if PISA is the right measure, but learning outcomes generally, what you see there. Is there an optimum mix? Is there anything that is consistent across the top performing schools internationally, kind of at that country by country level that reinforces your thesis or introduces other complexities in kind of how those learning outcomes are assessed?
Yeah, so I think, I recall reading a couple of OECD reports, because the OECD had done this analysis using the PISA, and essentially, I think they came out not in favor of sort of choice or competition. They came out much more in terms of where schooling systems which are more egalitarian in nature also are sort of have better learning outcomes. This is research that I'm referring to, which is at least 5 or 6 years old. So I don't know what the latest numbers are saying, but on average, that is what I remember of that.
Because it's interesting when you referenced like high levels of civic engagement. If you triangulate some of the information with that, or you look at how politicized the issue is in the U.S. around everything, and then including vouchers, but everything around the educational environment. So it feels like it just muddies the waters. These other factors that possibly have nothing to do with the choice issue, but just have become just warp maybe things a little bit, or distort, perhaps is the right word.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that I fear. We're losing sight of the real issues because they've all taken on. While I want to understand the politics of the political economy of the school system, the politics that has actually emerged actually diverts us from these issues, right? It's not about what's best for the schools. It's about, hey, do I believe in a big government or a small government? Well, that's not really the question here. Whether you believe in a big government or a small government, what's better for the schools? That's the more important question, right? And yes, I think what's happening in the US, at least from the distance that I gather, I think many of these things which used to lend themselves to more rational reason debate seem to be dwindling, at least. Well, I'm sitting at a distance, so I have to acknowledge my limitations.
Thank you, thank you, Professor. My question to you is, given the current situation and the challenges facing in India, do you think India can bring the education system here, let's say the DSS education system to India? I do understand the perks of getting your kids into private school. I mean, you get better education, better resources, better teachers. I remember there's a Yale professor talking about the tyranny of meritocracy. He said, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And I believe that if you are the parents, if you can send your kids and they have higher chances, better chances to get into good universities and better quality of life in the future, I'm sure you will send your kids to that particular school. And for public school on the other side, some of my friends are studying and some of the best top schools in Hong Kong public schools. They face certain issues, even if they're studying such high level of competition, that the teachers there, they have no KPI. So their monthly salaries doesn't base on their performance. But I'm not sure if the DSS school in Hong Kong is the way out or the solution, because you can pay at affordable prices, but get some kind of the perks of private schools. For me, I'm studying at this DSS school. We do offer DSE and A levels with better options. We are subsidized by the government, and we do get more resources, such as we just have a new building, have dorm, have an indoor swimming pool. We have better teachers because their performance is based on their KPI, based on the performance of their students, which they're based on their public exam results. So I'm not sure if India can apply this kind of methodology to the society.
I mean, so we did have a history of aided schools like Hong Kong does, which has now diminished in number. So I know the aided and the DSS is still separate, but I'm just, of course, now we have this whole architecture, this 25% architecture to work with private schools, right? So I'm not necessarily sure whether at this point, taking on a new institutional architecture would be the best thing instead of working on deepening what we have. But I just wanted to, a couple of things that KPIs in the education space are notoriously difficult to work with, right? And so, for instance, the Pakistan case, where they were trying to give funding based on student performance, right? Invariably, and this is not just Pakistan. I mean, in Chicago, when they tried to pay teachers based on value added, there was corruption. There was rigging in terms of testing, right? So the other mechanism, of course, is you select the better students, so that then you end up performing better. You try to address that statistically, but still, nevertheless, it's a difficult. It's not straightforward, right? What the right KPIs would be. But nevertheless, I think we cannot curb competition, choice making on the demand side, because like water, it will find its way some way or the other, right? Whether through shadow education or through some other mechanism. I think we need to spend a whole lot more time on the supply side, strengthening these institutions, figuring out, okay, what's been working like I said, okay, why are parents, choosing private schools? These are not very difficult for government schools to also try and implement. It's not very difficult. I mean, difficulty is a relative idea, but to have a little bit better school environment which connotates learning or symbolizes learning, right? At the end of the day, if you have to build a particular culture, I think in the space of education, culture is a far more appropriate target to pay attention to, rather than trying to do it through KPIs. That's my sense of it, right? So if you could have better schools, and maybe or if the government schools also could, for instance, offer alternatives for IB where and the competition was based on pedagogy, right, or the content or the curricula, right? Maybe that's the way we need to move our institutions towards. But definitely not. I think the idea that we should be curbing choice making on the demand side seems to be a very losing proposition to me.
I think we have time for one more question, and there's someone from the Zoom audience that would like to join in, and then I'll wrap up with quick closing comments.
Yes, so there's a question from the Zoom audience. Maybe you have covered some points already, but the question is, instead of focusing on private school, what are the most achievable changes in the public school system that could improve the learning outcomes for a large population of students?
I would begin with the teacher selection and the entrance process, making sure that that is being done in a manner that corruption is weeded out. That would be sort of the first. Then the teacher training. Most of the teacher training at this point is a very bank-based system. It's as if you just you deposit it at the beginning and then you forget about them, and every once in a year you go and deposit some more, and then it's not an interactive education or teacher training that happens either. So if the question is about Indian public education, I would definitely begin with the question of selection of teachers. All right, thank you.
I'll just say a few remarks, but first of all, please everyone join me in thanking Professor Sarin. Very thought-provoking conversation. So thank you very much.
you.
And I will just grab a couple of closing notes here, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah.
So again, sharing your research and this conversation, thank you all of you for joining us. I'm just going to note a couple of things happening here on the university campus as we step into the new year. A number of exciting things lined up. I'm just going to mention a few, but just would encourage you to stay in touch with us this Wednesday, in fact. So you are very welcome on Wednesday to join us. 5:30 p.m. We have Mr. Guy Bradley, JP, chairman of John Swire and Sons Hong Kong Limited and Swire Pacific Limited. He'll join us on campus, sharing insights from his rich and varied career, as well as how he and his team execute visionary real estate projects that stand the test of time. Those of you based here in Hong Kong will know, I'm sure, the name well. And then also, don't miss the chance to discover the remarkable story of Hong Kong's first Chinese-owned department store. So this is basically our ongoing rotating exhibition. We have these on campus from time to time. This one is titled Sincere, a Retail Revolution and Wholesale Social Change. And then it's been extended to March 31st of this year. So there is more opportunity to see that exhibition if you haven't already done so. And then we also have our summer academy. So very apropos for today's conversation, the University of Chicago on this campus runs a number of summer academies for high school students in July, and they will return this year. We have 5 courses on offer. I think you can see perhaps those courses: data science, economics, of course, University of Chicago, you might expect those on the list, game studies and design, law, and public policy. So your sweet spot there, Professor Sarin. So these programs are approved by the UChicago summer session early notification option application, and the early bird application for these programs will start January 19th, so next Monday. And it's really an opportunity for high school students to experience a summer of discovery. Our faculty fly over from Chicago, discovery, learning, and empowerment with the faculty here based on this campus over a 3-week period for each of the programs. And of course, visit our website, www.uchicago.hk. We've got a newsletter you can subscribe to. You can follow us on all of the social media channels, whichever might be your favorite for information. And then finally, join me one more time in thanking Professor Sarin. And thank you all for coming this evening.